Greetings, everyone. My name is Doug Chapman, and I want to talk to you this morning about growing pecans. And we're going to start up in North Alabama. A lot of people don't think of North Alabama as being a place to grow pecans. They think more South Georgia or South Alabama. But this tree right here is 20 miles south of the Tennessee state line. The gentleman there in the photo is Mr. Gerald Gamble, and he is in his 90s now. And when that tree, when his parents got married, that was a big tree. So that tree's been there a while. The crop that you most probably think about in the Tennessee Valley is cotton, and we still do grow a lot of cotton up here, but most of the books that were written about pecans and growing pecans said that if you can grow cotton, you can also grow pecans. So that the pecan crop was mostly associated with a warm, long growing season type of climate. We're changing that a little bit, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. Currently, our main commercial production is in the southern third of the state. Mobile and Baldwin counties by far are the most commercial production. We've also got some production in southeast Alabama. And one of the reasons that that production exists in southeast Alabama and the production areas around Albany, Georgia, are because back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, some real estate companies went in and bought up a bunch of old land for very cheap prices, and they planted pecan trees on that property. And then they turned around and marketed those parcels in 5, 10, 15, 20 acre parcels to farm families. And the advertisement was that the pecans were established and the farm family would have a steady income from the pecans. That turned out, of course, not to be the case, but the neighbors that were successful would buy up the adjoining property there, and then their orchards increased in size, like that. And the company that did that in Alabama was called the Alabama Pecan Company, and you still see some of those old orchards in places like Russell County, Barber County, Bullock County, that area. We can expand our production now a little further north because we have some earlier ripening varieties or cultivars. The advantages there are that we are away from any of the coastal storms like hurricanes. That's something you always tend to worry about if you're on the coast. And then possibly maybe a little less disease pressure further north on a more elevated site. Pecans are native to North America. They are hickories. They're in the genus Caria. The first European reference that we have about pecans is from a Spaniard named Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. De Vaca was part of an expedition that landed in what is now, we think, Tampa Bay area, and a number of them, about 40 of them, were abandoned. The ship left and they had no way to get back. This was in the very early 1500s, before De Soto, and about 35 or so of them decided that they would try to walk to Mexico City. Keep in mind, they had no idea how far it was, so they just they started out in their travels, it took them, a long time, 4, 5, 6 years. And Devaka and three others, 4 people actually survived the trip and made it all the way around. And Devaka went back to Spain and wrote a book about his travels. One of the things that he mentions in that book is that when they got to what is now Texas, the Indians more or less captured them and held them against their will, and they went to an island in a river. We think that may have been the Brazos River now. They went to that island to eat pecans, but that they only went every 3rd year. So that very first reference to pecans is also a reference to alternate bearing, which is a production problem that we still have to deal with today. This is the native range of pecan. It is, as you can tell there, native to the Mississippi Valley drainage area, and then to the west into Texas, Oklahoma, a little bit up into Kansas and Missouri, also Iowa, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, and down into Mexico. But notice this little area right here in West Alabama. There do appear to be a population of native pecan over there, and we have some documentation for that. The Alabama Geologic Survey, which is headquartered there at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, published a book called Economic Botany of Alabama. The botanist that wrote that book was Roland Harper, and he took these photos in 1924 in Perry and in Marengo County of some very old, very large trees that appear to be native pecan. And we actually have Harper's field notes, so we can actually go in and look and see exactly where he was. And another interesting thing about this particular area, it is also the area that another hickory, nutmeg hickory, is the most abundant. Nutmeg hickory is one of the rarest of the hickories, and it is only abundant in this particular area. Now, I did not know about Harper's pictures in this book when I took this picture, which is really in the same area. We were in Marengo County, basically right very close to where he was. If these trees exist as a population, I think these have as good a claim to be native as any that we might find. This is just this is an area very close to Faunsdale in Marengo County. One thing that you need to realize about growing pecans outside of the traditional growing region is that sometimes you may encounter a late spring freeze. Now, 2007 was a very unusual year. We had several weeks of very unseasonably warm temperatures, and then on Easter weekend, Easter Sunday morning, the temperature dropped into the low 20s. The pecans had put out and were beginning to shed pollen, or were just getting ready to shed pollen, and this freeze occurred and basically hurt everything that had put out. There were no peaches, no apples that year. It was just a really unusual year. It's the only time I've ever seen pecans get hurt by a freeze. All cultivars, is, without exception, including the so-called northern cultivars, were damaged. There was a there is a USDA variety called Creek. We had a few of those trees here, and we lost 88% of them. They were totally killed um, down to the stump by that freeze. Our average growing season, our average frost-free period, is about April 15th to October 15th, or about 180 days. Now, that trend is changing. We know the weather patterns are changing. We are staying a lot warmer later into the fall. We are also seeing that we are having later and later spring freezes. So these dates are just more or less reference points, and no 2 years are anywhere near the same. So let's talk about grafting and budding. This is a picture of a tree, an older tree that obviously was grafted. You can see the graft union there, just about a foot up the trunk of that tree, because there is a very distinctive change in the bark texture here. So this tree was a grafted tree. So why do we graft and bud pecans? Well, each and every seedling is unique. In other words, if you plant seed, it's not going to be the same thing as the parent. It's going to be a unique tree. It will have some characteristics of the parents, but it will not be the same. So in order to have the named cultivars or the standard varieties, it's necessary to vegetatively propagate, and you do that by grafting or budding. The reason we do it by grafting or budding is because pecans essentially do not root. If you took a cutting and tried to root it, it wouldn't root. There have been some studies where they did produce some roots on the pecan cuttings, but the trees did not survive transplanting. So we use seedlings, we plant seed, and we graft on top of those seedlings. Now in the southeast, the traditional rootstocks are Elliott and maybe Candy. I am using Moore up here in the Tennessee Valley simply because it has it doesn't put out as early in the spring. It's a little bit later putting out, so that's an advantage for us up here. Out west, they have some different soils, higher pHs, less rainfall, and they use Riverside and Apache as seed for the rootstock. And when I say out west, I'm talking about Texas and Oklahoma, and then points west of there. Grafting and budding is not new. The Romans called it an ancient art. The Apostle Paul mentions it in the 11th chapter of the book of Romans when he talks about the wild olive being grafted into the stock of Israel. The first pecans that we know that were grafted successfully were grafted by a slave named Antoine on Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana in about the year 1846 or 47. There may be a couple of his trees still living that he grafted. The variety that he used was called Centennial. So, the first orchards, I guess you might say, really before that, people would just go out and collect the pecans, pick them up off the ground in where they grew naturally, in Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas and Mississippi Delta and places like that. And they would just put them in barrels and ship them. The first orchards that were planted, though, were planted from seed, and they weren't grafted. Now later on, when the grafting technique was perfected, You had some nurseries around Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and in New Orleans that started supplying the southeast with trees. Monticello, Florida area had a lot of nurseries that popped up. Maybe one or two of them are still around, actually. And then you had some nurseries in Texas that started growing trees for new orchards. How do you get a named variety? Well, traditionally you would collect a outstanding wild tree that you might find growing in a native natural setting, and if it was outstanding in some way or another, you would propagate it. Or I mentioned the orchards that were planted from seed. You tended to plant the seed from your very best native varieties, and then the result of that, there would be some chance seedlings in those orchards that you would find to be outstanding and propagate those. If you're going to do control crosses, however, that is where you know the seed parent and the pollen parent, you have to go through some techniques to ensure that you know those parents. First breeding program that we know of, a formal breeding program at least, was by a gentleman in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, named Charles Forkert. And he's actually, one of his cultivars, Desirable, is the main commercial cultivar in the southeast. Now, it's got some problems. It's very susceptible to scab, but that is one of his crosses. There's also an outstanding pecan called Forkert that is beginning to be grown around. The USDA breeding program, I think, started back in the 40s and 50s, and they actually came to see Mr. Forkert when they started the USDA program, and there was some kind of disagreement, and when they left, Mr. Forkert was a little incensed and insulted, and he took all his records out in his backyard and burned them. So we don't know precisely all of the crosses that he used to make his crosses, but with the DNA technology where we can sequence the DNA on some cultivars, we've been able to determine the parentage of some of them. The USDA program right now is still active, but we've had a couple of key people retire recently, so it's not as active as it once was. A very active program that is still ongoing is at the University of Georgia. The main commercial variety back in times past was Stewart. At one time, Stewart, there were more Stewart pecan trees planted around the world than all of the varieties combined. Stewart actually started out, a man from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, was visiting Mobile, Alabama. He bought a bag of pecans and took them home and planted them in his garden sometime in the late 1800s, and one of those seedlings turned out to be Stewart. It began to be propagated and disseminated around, and there were just lots and lots of Stewarts planted. Up until the mid-1960s, Stewart was resistant to scab, which is a fungal disease that destroys the nut shucks and leaves, and it's very susceptible to stem tissue. You have to spray fungicides for it now. Stewart became susceptible back in the mid-1960s. So you do have to spray Stewart now. It's also very attractive to an insect called pecan phylloxera. And the thing about Stewart, it wasn't extraordinary in a lot of different ways, but Dr. Fred Bryson mentions in his book Pecan Culture that Stewart had a good combination of average qualities. So that was the calling card for Stewart. This is a newer variety, one from USDA, very early maturity date, traditionally, and it's scab resistant. Kanza is a very high quality kernel. The nut's not really all that big, but with the big high quality kernel and early maturity date, it's very desirable to plant in more northern areas. Average shuck split date for us here in the Tennessee Valley is September 18th, whereas something like Stewart would be on over into October, maybe a month later. And the reason that's important is because the tree has time to recoup its energy input into the crop after that nut matures. As in the case of Kanza, it has a full month or more for the leaves to recoup some energy and to store some carbohydrates and get it through the winter and into the next spring where it will flower and fruit. Here's another early pecan, another USDA variety, Lakota. Average shuck split on it here in the Tennessee Valley is September 23rd. So another early maturing cultivar. It is scab resistant, a little bigger nut, a little higher percent kernel. So this would be another good choice for planting in more northern areas. We're looking at some new seedlings. You're always trying to find something better than what you've got. Is it scab resistant? Is it a big nut? Is it high quality nut? So forth and so on. This is one that we have looked at now for a good little while. Tobacco Barn. It's a seedling from Waycross, Georgia. That's a picture of the original tree there on the left. The nut is not a very big nut, but it's got a good high quality kernel, 56% kernel. It's not necessarily early, but this nut has a very good shelling characteristic. In other words, when you crack this pecan, it basically falls into halves. So that's a very good characteristic for this particular variety. If it was just a little bit bigger, it might be something really special, and it is scab resistant. Now, one other thing about it, it does tend to alternately bear. So if you plant this one, you would need to manage the crop load. And when I say manage the crop load, that means you would probably need to thin it. And we do that by shaking the tree in the late summer and trying to shake a few of the nuts off, just as the same reason you would thin peaches or apples. Here is Tobacco Barn by what I think is probably its parent, Schley. Schley was the benchmark of quality, very high quality pecan, over 60% kernel, and if you can see here side by side, they look very similar. Tobacco Barn has some characteristics that are very similar to Schley as well. Here's one that we found over in the Albertville area. We're calling it Sparks because that's the name of the man that had the tree. We lost the original tree in the April 27, 2011 storms that came through Alabama, all the tornadoes. But we had already collected some graft wood from the tree, and we had it in several places around. This one is scab resistant. It's a big nut. And you know, so far it's been okay, but one of the things that I'm sort of hesitant to release this pecan. One of the reasons I wouldn't release it, in other words, is because it tends to load up in a real heavy crop load, and when that happens, it tends not to fully fill out. So, but if you could thin the nuts and maybe put it in some irrigation, it may do okay. Jury's still out on this one, in other words. Here's another one. This is a big nut. It's 38 nuts per pound, very high quality kernel, no scab. It's about average as far as maturity for any of our traditional pecans. We're calling this Ronald Johnson. It's got a lot of good qualities, and we haven't looked at it quite long enough to decide whether or not it's a keeper, but it's got a lot of things going for it. Scab resistant cultivars. Well, this is important, especially for homeowners who cannot spray their trees, because if you have a scab susceptible variety, your production is just incidental. But if you plant the scab resistant varieties, perhaps you can get by without having a lot of trouble with scab. Now that list is kind of short. Right now we're looking at Kenza and Lakota, which are USDA varieties. Gafford, Macmillan, and Amling are Alabama selections that have a good resistance to scab. Elliott is actually an older variety that originated down in Florida, and it's still resistant to scab, and it's being planted in orchards still in Georgia and Alabama. And a couple of new ones. Huffman is a University of Georgia variety. It's a big nut, very similar to Desirable, but it does not scab, so we're looking at it. Avalon is the newest one from Georgia, another large nut that does not scab. The Georgia varieties are patented, and you will have to buy them from a licensed nursery. I want to talk about a couple of other selections that we're looking at from USDA, and we'll go ahead and look at those. 1997-34-0017 is an advanced selection that they're looking at. The way USDA numbers their crosses is 1997 is the year the cross was made. The number 34, the middle number, indicates the parents. In other words, the number 34 that year were such and such parents. And then this was the 17th seedling out of that cross. The parents were actually numbered selections themselves, but they both are from what we would consider to be northern selections. What that does for us, it gives us some very early nut maturity. This one is a type 1 pollination. That just means that the pollen is shed early before the female flowers are receptive. A type 2 would have female flowers receptive first and then shed pollen late. And you need type 1 and type 2 trees in orchards for cross-pollination. This is not a very big nut. It's 65 nuts per pound, but it's high percent kernel, and in Texas it has a good scab rating. In other words, it tends not to scab in Texas. But you have to understand something, that the growing conditions in Texas are vastly different from those in the southeast. So we don't know how this is going to do yet. That's the reason we have tests and experiments. Here's another one, 1996-01-0295. Another good looking nut. This is actually a control cross from two other USDA varieties, Pawnee and Waco. Again, early nut maturity, type 1 pollination, like I said, a bigger nut, higher percent kernel, and low scab rating in Texas. Well, that's going to finish us up, and I appreciate you being here today, and look forward to talking to you in the future.